It's okay that. All right. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Bismillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulullah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Jazakallah khair again for all of you for attending, for being our honored guests once again. So inshallah, so that way we don't waste any time, inshallah, let's get right into it. So today we will cover two other units that are covered in the Bioscience and Islam curriculum. First and foremost being, again, we are covering the 5 fundamental questions. And the one we would be covering today is, what is the human's future? And to answer that question, we will cover human enhancement and transhumanism. And then in Unit 5, the fundamental question there is, are human actions predetermined? And here we will have discussions on fate and genetic determinism, inshallah. So the one thing that I want to kind of just reiterate from last time is that we mentioned that there is the epistemic framework worksheet that all of you had received. And so just to kind of keep in mind, right, something that you should have on hand, hopefully just kind of intellectually looking at these concepts as we go through, so that way, inshallah, on Thursday, when we have our last session, we will be going over this framework, inshallah, so that way we're kind of taking a look at it and thinking about it as well, inshallah. So to come to this discussion, right, about the pertinent question that we had discussed last time was, what does it mean to be human, right? We determined that the human is not only a body, but also includes the soul and consciousness as well. And it was pretty obvious that, you know, AI and perhaps robots can't completely replace us as human beings. But what about science to improve the human being itself? Right. So in this first section, we'll be exploring how notions of human enhancement and transhumanism impacts how we think about the use of biotechnologies and the practices of science and medicine as well. And we'll consider to what extent and if we even should be improving the human bodies. So in this, we'll think about, right, we think about like cyborgs and robotic parts and things like that as something that's maybe futuristic or something like that. But here, the reality is that this is science today, right? These are things that we are actually facing, and scientists are actually researching and doing experiments and really trying to figure out, can the human body be extended? And so in order to understand that, I would like to have you guys watch this short clip about how transhumanism actually functions.
The A to Z of isms, transhumanism. Most of us would consider the end of the human race as a catastrophe. There are some, however, who will not only rejoice at it, but want to hasten the day it arrives. Transhumanists look forward to a future in which Homo sapiens is superseded by a better, smarter, fitter model, humanity 2.0.
I'm going to try to see if I can extend this just a second, so that way we can watch it full screen. There we go.
Humans are in dire need of improvement. Any species that causes huge damage to our environment, can't feed itself even though it has enough food, and fights countless wars costing millions of lives, must surely benefit from an intelligence upgrade. Our lifespans are short, our final years usually characterized by diminishing health and vitality, often accompanied by a drop-off in cognitive capacity. 1 in 3 people born in 2015 are expected to get dementia. Is this really the best we can hope for? Transhumanists think not. Aging could be stopped and even reversed. Enhancements could dramatically raise our IQs and make us stronger and fitter. We might even be able to leave our fragile bodies behind and upload ourselves to computers, living forever in virtual worlds. Improving humanity through science and technology could radically change us. Such a new beginning would in effect be the end of humanity as we know it. Many transhumanists see this as not only desirable, but inevitable. The scientist and futurist Ray Kurzweil believes we are approaching what he calls a singularity, the point at which computers become smart enough to learn for themselves, after which they will rapidly become smarter and smarter. The future belongs to artificial intelligence. The only way for humanity to survive is to embrace it and become wholly or partially artificial ourselves. The thought of being replaced by a new form of humanity is bound to be unsettling. But transhumanists think we would be wrong to lament the end of humanity as we know it, when what replaces us would be so much better. It would be like wishing children never grew up, or that Homo erectus never evolved into Homo sapiens. If the transhumanists are right, we could be one of the last generations of humans to roam the planet. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell to receive notifications for new videos. See you again soon.
So, thoughts. What do you guys think? Reactions to what do we just see? Any ideas? Scary ideas. Okay. Let's connect to kind of some of the things that we've talked about last time. Yeah, definitely scary, depressing. Okay, right. So yeah, here. So if we're thinking about some of the ideas that we talked about last time, what about where's the soul in this picture, right? Where they didn't mention or describe anything that's related to the soul in this aspect of this improvement that we're doing to the human being, right? And then again, yes, right, pretty interesting things, right? May Allah will protect us for sure. The things are, there's no consciousness that is mentioned here, right? Again, that aspect of the soul is completely missing from the picture of and this discussion, right? So just to kind of recap some of the things that are mentioned in transhumanism as their basic elements of what they're trying to portray is that first and foremost, human beings are considered this unfinished product, right, of evolution. Again, going off of the back of discussion from last time. And so here, their concept is that, you know, we've advanced in our abilities compared to other animals, right? But there's still more advancement that could be possible, right? So evolution continues as time continues. So we as human beings are still evolving, right? We haven't reached this best or better version yet. And so therefore, we can probably help that process along, right? Now, one may ask, what if since we're naturally changing anyway, why not just speed up that process, right? And so if we can speed up that process, perhaps now we can take control of the results of that, right? Of what that process of evolution could do. So if we think about it, these are some of the questions that really come up, right? Let's look at the ideology behind, right? So those were kind of the principles or the concepts, but what about the ideology behind transhumanism, right? These ideas define the way that transhumanism takes shape and what scientists believe they can and cannot do, right? And our goal will be to identify those ideas backing transhumanism and then see how they correlate or how we would talk about them or discuss them in Islamic principles. So when we're looking at these two views, right, the transhumanist view and the Islamic view, we have a lot of these pertinent questions that will come up, right? So first and foremost, what does it mean to make humans better, right? So the answer to this question would be different based on what is the purpose of the human being, right? If you think the human being's purpose is to maximize personal pleasure, try to live forever, right, as transhumanists do, then you will have a very particular idea of what it means to make the human better, right? If you think that human beings are a body and a soul, right, and that death is a looming reality, and the purpose of this life is to maximize what we do in this life for the sake of the next life, right? Then your idea of how a human can be better is completely and drastically different, right? So then also the transhumanist goal is challenged here, right? So perhaps maybe if a transhumanist has some Islamic perspective, perhaps their focus was be trying to make a spiritual experience better, right? Or making some changes that a person becomes more obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Fulfills the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala a little bit easier. Okay. So that brings us to the next question. Will we be able to make humans better? Right? Is that even a possibility? If a human being is just material body, then the functioning of the human being becomes the most important aspect, right? And so the focus would be then making the human being functionally better, right? Making the body stronger, impervious to disease. But this view, again, like as many of you have mentioned, it ignores the part of the human being that is the essence, right? The consciousness, the soul, right? These spiritual states that us as human beings go through. And so here, that then leads to my last question here would be, will humans be able to live forever? Again, this goes back to the fundamental belief of what it means to be a human being, right? How we define a human being. From an Islamic perspective, right? This is an easy question. We know that our journeys and of our souls goes through various stages, and forever for us means in the hereafter, right? It doesn't mean forever in this world. But how exactly that forever life as a transhumanist is, that would depend on exactly what enhancements then they would encourage, right? So if we think about, again, coming back to our discussion from last time about human beings, right? We discussed how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created us, and he created us in the best form, right? We talked about لَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ فِي أَحْسَنِ تَقْوِيمٍ, right? So we are أَحْسَنِ تَقْوِيمٍ. But we didn't really talk about what does the best form exactly mean, right? So if we think about and look at this, we are talking about the concepts of how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us in the best form means the best way for our optimal and proper function, right? So we know that the proper function or purpose of each body part, like for the eyes is to see, right? For the ears is to hear, right? So we say that the anatomy follows the physiology of the body part. But what about the entire human being, right? The whole human being. So what is the purpose of the entire human being collectively, right? So we know that the purpose of us as human beings is to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in this way, the best form of the human being is not the strongest, the fastest, the insusceptible to disease, one that lives forever. It is a form that best fulfills this purpose of knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is in reference to not just the bodily form, but obviously a spiritual form as well. So the spiritual form can change when we purify it, right, through gratefulness and being humble. It can also be distorted when we have acts of lying and showing off and such sins, right? So therefore, humans have been created in the best potential to freely choose to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's what is meant by the best form, right? And obviously there can be multiple interpretations of this, but this gives you that understanding that it doesn't mean that we are bodily perfect only, right? Now, if we think about it also, right, in this very same surah, Surah At-Tin, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that we are ahsani taqweem, the very next ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, ثُمَّ رَدَدْنَاهُ أَسْفَلَ سَافِلِينَ, right, that we will be reduced, but we will reduce them to the lowest of the low, right? And that's what happens when a human being doesn't fulfill this potential, right? And so this aligns with the concept of Islam that all of our Sharia rules are for our betterment, right? For our benefit, right? Whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us to do, it's so that we can benefit from them. And whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us to refrain from, it's because it's going to cause us harm, right? And so this is that understanding of fulfilling that potential of being the best human being or being in that best form. Now, let's look at some of the ayat that helps us to answer some of these questions about changing the human being, right? One idea of changing the human being that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in Surah An-Nisa, and surely I will command them and they will change Allah's creation. Whoever chooses shaitan for a patron instead of Allah is verily a loser, and his loss is manifest. So in this ayah, we see that shaitan is the impetus for change, right? He is the one who is encouraging that change. And so it's mentioned that shaitan will command human beings to change the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, that could be us as human beings as well, right? We are a creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or even other human beings or other creations. So this differs, right, from the transhumanistic thought, because remember, they believe human beings as part of this evolutionary process, right? Not just a being that was created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So there are various hadith that also testify to this concept of changing human beings. But because this changing is commanded or influenced by shaitan, right? The fuqaha have mentioned that this was where that impermissibility lies, right? Now, I'm going to kind of really jump because of brevity and time and all of that. But to have this kind of very oversimplified summary of this concept, and not to get into the details of exactly what's permissible and what's impermissible, but just for us to have that kind of higher level thinking and processing, there is this principle that it is unlawful to change or beautify a human being by any effective, significant, and permanent change. But if it's used as a medical treatment, then it would be considered permissible, right? So, for example, cutting your hair, right? Not a significant permanent change because, again, your hair grows back, right? But let's say, for example, breaking your legs, right? So in one of the examples that's mentioned in the curriculum is of height, right? So if a person wants to grow taller, what a procedure that they can do is the doctor will break the legs, elongate them, and allow them to heal in this elongated form, right? Now, that is for a purpose that would be an enhancement of the human being, right? Making them a considerably taller person in a way that they would advise, right? But contrast that to medical treatment. For example, if a person gets into a car accident and their legs break, and therefore it's needed to do that procedure in order for them to heal, right? So this is where we understand that difference, right? For example, even cosmetic surgery, right? For mere beautification purposes, it would be impermissible. But let's say, for example, somebody has a disfigurement on their face. In order for that to be acceptable, it would be a medical treatment, right? Again, I'm oversimplifying just so that way we at least understand the concept, but not being a straightforward rule, just so that way we understand that obviously this would go through a process of consulting Muslim doctors and scholars and making sure that this would be permissible or not. And there's a lot of complexities in trying to figure out here whether it is treatment or whether it's enhancement. And inshallah, we'll look into that in just a little bit. But these are all questions that fuqaha have discovered or discussed with doctors, right? And obviously, each of these would be considered, the conclusion would be there on an individual basis. But even though we don't get into kind of this idea or concept or the fiqh details about disease and healing, let's look at what is the Islamic perspective on illnesses and healing in general, right? And really just kind of understanding this overarching principle. So let's look at what our scripture says, right? What the Quran mentions. So here, the very first ayah here is where Prophet Ibrahim al-Islam, when he's describing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his power, he explains, وَإِذَا مَرِضْتُ فَهُوَ يَشْفِينِي. That when I fall ill, he is the one who cures me, right? So from the get-go, we understand that the cure actually comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And we'll kind of just run through this quickly because, again, these are probably principles that most of us understand. But I wanted to bring it to our forefront of our minds so that we have this when we're thinking about some of the things that we'll come to in a minute. There's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that mentions, مَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ دَاءً إِلَّا أَنزَلَ لَهُ شِفَاءً. Right? That there is no disease that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has sent down except that he has sent down its healing as well, right? So here we understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the illness comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as well as the cure for it as well. The effort that we as human beings need to do is go search for that cure, right? We need to put forth some effort in this process as well, right? And there's others that describe how Allah, the Prophet specifically commanded them to go seek, right? The dawah, ibadullah, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is commanding the servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to seek that treatment, right? And then obviously, that being a command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that means that we should be seeking out treatments, right? But there's also this aspect of having tawakkul in Allah, right? So we as Muslims have this theistic view of illnesses and diseases, but there's also an aspect of internal as well as external, right? So that external would be seeking out that cure, but the internal is also understanding that all of this comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And then not only should one first put forth their effort to find that and seek treatment, but then also internally trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Have hope from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We should be making that dua. We should understand that all of that is independent of what happens, right? The result is in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's hands as well. And so the physician is only the normative association that is the avenue for that cure, right? Or for that healing that takes place, right? So in reality, we understand the control is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether that medicine actually proves to be healing or not. And so again, this is that understanding of what healing is from an Islamic perspective. And so now when we talk about what doctors do and how doctors approach disease, then it becomes a little bit of an understanding that this is just a normative understanding of what a doctor does, right? And so what we see is that doctors look at disease in various ways, right? So that's where we see the 4Ds, right? There's disease, right? That a person is uneasy, therefore he is diseased. And so therefore the doctor's job would be to make that person at ease again, right? Or the aspect of disability, right? So again, a person is unable, and therefore the doctor helps that person become able again, right? The other concept is disorder, right? A person has a disorder, meaning more so in society, they aren't able to function properly. And so therefore a doctor or a professional will help them to come back to that normative understanding of what order looks like, right? Similarly is dysfunction, right? So there's an abnormality or an impairment that a person has according to the norms of physiology and social behavior. And therefore now a physician will then bring them back to that normal functioning, right? So bioscience develops treatments to address these conditions, right? These maladies that we have as human beings. And so therefore, in certain aspects, human bodies are actually being changed, right? Now, normality changes over time and across space is a thing that normally happens, right? So for example, the things that are normal for me as an adult aren't the same as what is considered normal for a child, right? So that changes over time. And the same thing across space, right? Let's say, for example, I live in a part of the world in which 6 feet is an average height for a human being, right? And then if I'm 5 feet, therefore now I'm abnormal, right? And vice versa can happen as well. So there's all of these understandings of what we consider to be disease or something that is not normal, right? And so here, when we're looking at these claims, we look at how these are empirical propositions, right? We're looking at just the symptoms and things that are behind it. And when we look at empirical propositions, we see that a lot of these are based on probabilistic knowledge, right? So this is where we talked about qat'i dhanni, right? So whenever we're talking about illness and health and all of these aspects, these are actually dhanni aspects, right? When we're looking at symptoms, we can only observe and then the doctor can make an assessment, right? These will not be in terms of qat'i, right? Now, kind of going along these same lines, when we look at what a doctor does, right, there can be, and when we're looking at how human beings can be changed, we look at this concept of treatment and enhancement, right? So to differentiate the two and understand what the difference is between the two, we would say anything that is medically induced, right? It's a medical practice. We would consider it to be therapy or a treatment. Whereas anything that is prescribed by a non-medical professional, we can say that that might be enhancement. Okay. Also, if we're restoring normal functioning, right, like we just discussed, right, that would be something that we would consider therapy. And then if there's something that is removing this dysfunction, disability, right, restoring that normal functionality, all of this would be then considered therapy, right? And that's really the goal of therapy, right? To restore a function that is considered to be normative. Okay. Now, anything more than that, anything beyond that would then be enhancement, right? Things that are you're exceeding normal limits of what bodily functions is, right? If you're improving beyond species specific, right, norms of what biological function is, that would be then enhancement, right? And comparatively, if a person is off or below the normal curve of human functioning, right, and they want to get back to that normal curve, we would consider that therapy. But if somebody is going beyond that normal curve, this is where we would understand it to be as enhancement. Okay. So to really understand this concept, what we're going to do is we're going to have a group discussion, right? And we're going to look at whether these three cases are therapy or whether they would be considered enhancement. Okay. So we have 16 participants here. And I need to divide them into 3 groups. Okay, let's see. So I'm going to just say, I'm just going to pick off from the list that I have here. I think it is in alphabetical order, but I would like Sister Amina, Farhana, and Farheen, and Sister Asia to take on the first case here, right? And I'll go through what all 3 cases are, but just so that way I'm mentioning it now, so the group, so that way you know which one to pay attention or a special attention to, right? Inshallah, we'll pay attention to all of them. And then Sister Juwaria, I'm going to butcher this name, but Kinan Didi or Did, Brother Khalil, and Sister Mai, and Sister Rehana, right? You will get the LASIK eye surgery. And then the last group will be Brother Robert and Brother Saad, if you'd like to participate, more than welcome. Sister Shazia, and let's see here, this last name, and Sister Shazmeen. Okay, so you all will get new clarity. So what I will do is I'm going to explain the scenario, right? What those 3 cases are, and then you will decide and discuss whether it is going to be, and bring up your points of arguing whether it's going to be therapy or whether you think it is enhancement. Okay, so first and foremost, we have the Tommy John surgery. So Tommy John surgery is a surgery that repairs the ulnar collateral ligament, right? Many people have heard of ACL, right, because of basketball and football and things, but this is the UCL, right? So this is in the ulna. So this usually tears over overuse. And usually this happens in athletes like pitchers, right? So Tommy John was a Los Angeles Dodgers pitcher in 1974, and he was the first person to undergo this reconstructive surgery. And when the surgery was successful, he returned to actual Major League Baseball. And so the surgery was actually named after him. So after the surgery, the recovery stage was about a year, right? And in that first year, he wasn't able to actually use his elbow to the full potential. And then after this year of recovery, he went back to baseball, started pitching again, and he was actually able to pitch faster than what he did before he even had the surgery. Okay. So that's scenario number 1, right? That's case number 1. The next case is LASIK eye surgery. So many of us have probably heard of LASIK eye surgery, right? LASIK eye surgery is commonly performed. It's laser refractive surgery that corrects vision problems, right? So that way a person doesn't need glasses and contacts and things anymore. So LASIK often offers improved vision without the hassle of glasses and contact lenses. But in general, there's a good chance to achieve 20/40 vision with this refractive surgery, right? So that's beyond a normal, like 20/20 is considered normal or perfect vision, right? So that's case number 2. And I'm trying not to encourage with my voice of which one it should be. So I'm trying to be as neutral as possible, even in the way I'm presenting this. So the last one is New Clarity, right? New Clarity is a brain supplement that helps improve cognitive function by increasing the neurotransmitters efficiency, right, within the brain. And so what it does is it boosts memory retention, it provides clarity, and helps with information recall as well, right? And so it claims to reduce brain fog and increases your cerebral blood flow and all of these things in order to allow this enhancement or this improvement to work, okay? So what I'll do is I will give you guys about 2 minutes to kind of think of what you would consider these cases. Do you consider your case to be therapy? And again, be able to explain why. Or do you consider it to be enhancement? And obviously explain why. And if you guys are ready to, you can again either unmute and provide your defense, or you can go ahead and just put it in the chat as well. Sure, Sister Amina, I just got your message. Not a problem. Okay, wonderful. So we've got some responses coming in. So I will go just so that way we can kind of make sure that we hit each of these. But since it seems like, mashallah, the LASIK group is on it. So let's cover that first, right? So if we're talking about LASIK eye surgery, right? So LASIK eye surgery, your group considered it to be therapy because it's restorative medicine. Let's see here. Yep, your group member conferred. They said therapy as well because it restores vision to what would be considered normal. Okay, LASIK eye surgery is considered medically needed. Okay, so talking about LASIK eye surgery, what about the fact that it is normal to have vision impairments, right? If a person ages, that's normal, right? For you to slowly lose that perfect vision as you age. And now what we're doing is we're actually changing what is considered to be normal, right? So for you to have weakened eyesight is normal, right? So there is a defense for it to be enhancement as well. Okay. All right. So now we've got some aspects for Tommy John surgery. So let's look at Tommy John surgery. So Tommy John surgery is therapy because it is meant to treat a torn UCL. Any kind of enhancement is a side effect. Okay. Let's see here. Oops, sorry. Is a side effect and not the intended purpose. Okay, good. Okay, so again, your team member also mentioned Tommy John surgery therapy. It's meant to restore stability and range of motion. Okay, so again, you guys considered it to be therapy. But what about the fact that a person can change their profession, right? It's not necessary for them to be a pitcher, right? It's a choice that they made. So if in this case, why not choose a different profession? And actually, the way that the surgery is performed is that it's actually the ligament from your leg is used to replace that ligament in your arm, right? And so obviously the ligaments in your legs are a lot stronger and thicker than what is in your arm, right? So if a torn ligament is caused due to this constant stress, right, perhaps you should change that stress, right? And then a pitcher would not need such a surgery, right? So the normal population doesn't use their elbow to the degree that is considered what a pitcher does, right? So this is also already outside of the norm threshold, okay? All right, what about nuclearity? Nuclearity can also be enhancement if it's just used to improve brain function in the absence of disease, okay? I think that nuclearity is an enhancement because it reduces brain fog. It also is a natural supplement, okay? Nuclearity therapy if used in patient with impaired cognitive function, okay? So your group is divided, right? So you have both therapy as well as enhancement, right? So again, same aspect, right? So if it's enhancement, because it's being used to boost cognitive function, right? You have a normal and you want it to boost it, right? And not restore just or bring it to normal levels, right? Because somebody is impaired or has a decreased level or something like that. Whereas if it's therapy, because if a person is required to memorize a lot of information, right? This is something that is actually a thing in today's society, right? We have this information overload, right? So society actually expects us to know more things, to have this kind of attention span, societal expectations at school, at work, right? These are things that we are expected to have and to be able to be on top of, right? So this is kind of expected to be norm today, right? So if we look at what we discussed in both of these, right? And here, this is where you would actually, if you were presenting this to our students, right, we would have them actually analyze each of these. We can have them break up into groups and present each of their parts. But again, due to the lack of time, we're going to kind of just make sure that we get through this. But you'll see that technically, you can make an argument both ways, right? You can make an argument that these are all therapy, but you can also make a case that all of these can be enhancement, right? It depends on the justification and what the purpose of doing these procedures are, right? So again, this is where I wanted to mention how the fiqh behind it can be complicated, right? There are things that you need to look at, but again, the purposes are going to be important here. So now, coming to a close for this session, what I want to mention is just a reminder, right, that puts this discussion of changing the human being into perspective. Right? It was narrated by Abu Hurairah that the Messenger of Allah وسلم, mentions that frequently remember the destroyer of pleasures, right? i.e., death. So there is no immortality in this life. As the best efforts of transhumanists, and as much as they want to put forth that effort to do so, we know on qat'i terms, right, that kullu nafsin dha'iqatul maut, right? That every soul will indeed experience and taste death. So it's part of our iman to believe in death, and death is a reality, right? It's a reality of life, and every single human being will experience this reality, right? And the important aspect to note here is that death actually gives our lives purpose, right? It makes our lives meaningful, right? There is a time limit for our life. So it instills urgency and motivation to do something, right? And the consequences of our actions in the hereafter, that accountability, that compensation that comes with it, it puts things into perspective, right? If a person lives a life of pain and suffering, perhaps because of old age, because of dysfunction or abnormalities that occur in their lives and whatever the situation might be, they understand that they're being rewarded for those experiences, right? And they will then be compensated with eternal bliss in the hereafter, in the next life. So therefore, that suffering now becomes meaningful and purposeful, right? If a person dies and that's it, there's no afterlife, and they've suffered all of these calamities of life, because every human being does experience suffering in their lives to various degrees, right? Then a person's life or existence becomes depressing, right? There's no purpose, right? Why would anyone want to continue to live if there was no purpose behind it, right? There was no compensation behind it. So there is this understanding that immortality is in the next life, right? Our souls go on, like we've discussed in the last session, that we will experience immortality, but that immortality is through the journey of our souls, right? And if we ignore this and expand life here on earth, then there's only so far that we can go because on qat'i terms, we know that there is an end. Okay. So with that, that brings me to the end of our first session. Any questions or comments on this first session? Sister Asia, what is the right answer? So that's the point, right? It's not necessarily there is one right answer, right? It would be on a case-to-case basis, right? Depending on what is the scenario of that person, consultation with scholars as well as Muslim doctors for that best of advice, and making sure that we don't cross that limit of the taghayyur, right? Of changing the human being in a way that would be impermissible. Any other questions? Right. And like I mentioned, right, it can be argued either therapy or enhancement. And really it comes with that, allowing students to really be able to think about it, right, to process that information and say, what is the reasoning behind whether they assign it to be therapy or enhancement? Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Right. We have those students really kind of tackle these concepts, and there's no technical right or wrong answer. Absolutely, Brother Robert. Okay. Okay, so now moving on to our next session, right? So the next session here, we will be discussing this concept of qada and qadar, right? And so here, what we're looking at is we're going to, in order to look at such a deep concept, right, that has puzzled human beings from the beginning of time until now, but alhamdulillah, we have some guidance with, we need to be able to define the terms, right, in order to be able to understand. And this is what we would like our students to understand as well, right, that whenever we're talking about a concept, a methodology, right, we need to be able to focus on the definition first, right, the tasawwur of it, when discussing this with students as well, right? So that way, if they have the proper definitions, then it will help them to then set a proper analysis of that discussion, right? So that's exactly what we'll do here. So this is the way that ulama have various ways that they have defined free will, right? So first and foremost, the ability to freely and consciously make choices that are not externally determined. Okay, so I freely, right? You're not forced to do something, right? And you are consciously able to understand, right? What is it that you are doing? The capacity of human beings to choose a course of action that among various alternatives, right? And so you have various options presented and you're able to choose from those options, right? Also, it means just voluntary choice, right? You have the ability to make a decision on your own. Okay. And then when we are defining determinism, right? Determinism would be ordained in advance, right? So there is this belief that all events, including human actions, are actually determined, right? And ultimately are determined because there is this external, that is something that is external to your will, right? To a person's own will. And so this implies that individual human beings have no free will, and they cannot be morally held responsible for their actions. Okay, so that would be determinism. Now, when we look at this concept, like when we're rationally going through this, we understand, well, I do have certain things that I do choose, right? I choose what I want to eat and drink today. I have chosen who I want to marry. I work towards achieving certain goals. So whether I work hard at it or I don't work so hard at it, or what I do in order to achieve that goal, all of these things are within my free will, right? Or at least I feel that they are, right? How I behave, am I kind to others? Am I mean to others? These are all things that I can choose, right? And same thing with, if we look at predetermined aspects of my life, I see that there are certain things that I didn't choose, right? I didn't choose where I was born. I didn't choose my ethnicity or my race, right? I didn't choose my gender. I didn't even choose how my body functions, right? There are many aspects of the respiratory system that works without my even thinking about it, right? So when we look at these things, we understand that, were we consulted for some of these things? Or are there things that I do have the option to choose from, right? And so there are areas of human life that I can make choices. I do have free will. And there are aspects in my life that have been predetermined for me, right? So let's put that into perspective, right? When we look at human existence, we understand that we do have both, right? We have the ability to freely act, as well as there are certain things that are determined for us. So if we look at three different aspects of the human being, right? We have physiological aspects as well as the psychological aspects. There are three dimensions that we can talk about here, right? There's first and foremost the laws of the physical body. There's natural instincts, and then there's optional choices, right? So some of the choices that I've mentioned. So let's look at each of these briefly. So first and foremost, if we're looking at the laws of the physical world, right? So these are laws that govern our physical life that we have no control over, right? So laws of motion, right? Gravity, right? I can't just fly if I feel like it or I will it, right? These are things that limitations that I have upon me, right? And so we will see that mankind is programmed and determined in certain aspects, right? Men and women have no free choice in these particular aspects that pertain to the laws of the physical world, right? So therefore, we would say that we do not have accountability for these events and these incidences in our lives, okay? So if there is no free will, it would be unfair to say that I don't have this aspect of accountability as well, okay? So we see this in the Quran as well, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions this, that in Surah Furqan, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that, where is this? Oh, He has created everything and ordained it precisely, right? فَقَدَّرَهُ تَقْدِيرًا, right? And another way of mentioning is measured it precisely, right? And so everything is well measured by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and things happen in its due time with perfect measurements. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also mentions that inna kulla shay'in khalaqnahu faqaddar, right? So that indeed we have created everything perfectly preordained, right? So everything is created following the measure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? It's been fixed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then, so here we see that these bodily or physical aspects of the human being are determined, right? They are fixed. There is no free will in this particular aspect. If we look at the next aspect, right, we're looking at natural laws, right? So, or we would say natural instincts, right? So these are aspects of our lives that we have, of the human psyche, that we have feelings towards, right? And these feelings are internal, they're inborn, right? And they're common to all of us, right? For example, like sexual desires. These are something that is innate to a human being, right? It's something that we have been placed with inside of us. Same thing with reflection, right? Our ability to think and process these ideas. And something as simplistic as hunger, right? We don't control our hunger at times, right? That we have these feelings of hunger. You can't control those sounds, those growls that come from your stomach sometimes, right? And the way that we look at these is these are gifts from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So when we look at how we examine this in terms of qada and qadar, right, we would say that man is not accountable for having these inborn aspects because they weren't acquired, right? They were something that was placed within us. But fulfilling these instincts is our choice, right? How we manage it, what we choose to do with it, right? How man chooses to guide him or herself desires in the right way or in the wrong way. So we would be accountable for directing the fulfillment of these inborn desires, but not having them particularly, okay? So for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, right? وَكُلُوا وَشَرَبُوا وَلَا تُسْرِفُوا, right? So eat and drink, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is allowing us to fulfill this feeling of hunger, right? Eat and drink. But the limitation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions is to control that, right? Do not go beyond a certain point, which will then become excessive, right? Don't have this kind of wasteful behavior, right? And this is the choice that we can make of how do we then deal with the feelings of hunger. Similarly, we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, do not go near adultery, right? وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الزِّنَا. right? So in this case, we were saying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that it is truly a shameful deed in an evil way. So human beings, we have natural sexual desires. It's an instinct. It's something that is within us, right? But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't tell us don't have those desires. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us to deal with them or fulfill them in the right way, right? Within the confines of marriage, right? Do not commit zina in order to fulfill that desire, right? So the way we fulfill it is within our choice. So what we do with these innate aspects is our choice and within our free will, and that's what we will be then accountable for. Okay, then comes to the last aspect, and the last aspect would then be that we are understanding optional choices, right? So here, these are the elements that we are completely within our choice. We have that ability to choose what we want to do. And when those options are presented in front of us, our quest should be to pick what is the best option, right? So we have that choice, whether we do that action or we don't do that action, right? For example, if we are given the opportunity to pray, we have the choice. Do we pray or do we not pray? Do we fast or do we not fast, right? And so in those aspects, even Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that he has given us that ability to choose, right? Whether we are grateful or ungrateful, so there's no predisposition here. We're given merely that choice, right? And then we use our intellect, we use our knowledge, we use that what we have in order to then make the right choice. So I'm going to skip through this because, again, these are something I think is very understandable, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us the direction of picking both ways, right? Whether we do right, whether we do wrong. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put this in every soul, right? That whether we follow that or not. And so that brings me to understanding this choice, or the ability to make choice, is where we have the understanding of mukallaf, okay? And again, this is kind of more recapping what we have discussed here already, right? So mukallaf is when a person is responsible, right? So for the three elements that we talked about, right? The natural laws, the instinctive natural aspects, as well as then optional choices, we see that we are accountable for half, which is the natural, for fulfilling the natural instincts and our optional choices. And we are not responsible for the natural laws of the world and having these natural instincts, okay? And so we are accountable only for what we are capable and able to do, right? And this would be physically as well as mentally. And so when we talk about who is not then accountable, right? The famous hadith of the Prophet ﷺ comes to mind, right? That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned, or the Prophet ﷺ mentions that the pen is lifted from three people, right? The sleeping person until he wakes, a child until he becomes an adult, and an insane person until he regains that aspect of sanity. And so these are the three types of people we would say would not be accountable for their deeds, right? And without the ability or the mental maturity to be able to do it, then we would say that this aspect of taklif is not present within them, right? But what we are, again, responsible and accountable for, we would say that that person is mukallaf, right? They have this ability to make those choices, okay? So that comes to this understanding of how does that then come hidayah, right? Where does hidayah play a part in this? And so what we see is that the role of hidayah is the presenting of these options, right? So here, this means that to be shown the way, right? So if a person is mukallaf, hidayah is an advice or information provided to someone to make that right choice, to make or choose that best option, right? And this is where we have, again, areas of accountability, right? That we would get this type of hidayah. And so there's these two aspects. There is an aspect of gaining hidayah on a general sense, right? And then there's a hidayah of a level of gaining some more specific, right? And this is where prophethood and obviously the Quran, right? Scriptural text would come into play, right? So take the example to able to understand this is if a person is asking for directions or you're giving directions and you say to the person, go north, right? That would be a general hidayah, giving them a general advice or an understanding, right? Whereas prophethood and the example of prophethood in the Quran, and this textual evidence that we have as hidayah would be a person where they're asking for advice or you're giving them directions and you put it in the GPS, where you give them those locations and you not only tell them this is how to get there, but perhaps you go along with them, right? And you say, okay, this is what the GPS says, this is how you go, and this is the directions that you need to follow, right? So here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us both of these types of levels of guidance, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala shows us the general direction, and he also assists the person in reaching that destination as well, right? So when a person doesn't take those directions that they're given, that means they don't want that help, right? So the same goes for our lives. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends messengers, right, and gives that hidayah, we can either choose to follow it, right, or not. And so when we choose to follow it, then we seek Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's help and assistance in being able to reach that destination. Okay. So this is that understanding of qada and qadar. So what I'd like to do here is I'd like to pause and hand it over to Brother Saad. And before I do that, just wanted to mention kind of this general principality of what qada and qadar is, right? So qada refers to the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows everything, past, present, and future, right? And then qadar would be this understanding of this specificity, right? That it reflects that level of divine destiny where it allows particular events and conditions to happen at a specific time and place, right? So qada means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's knowledge of all events in life, where qadar refers to bringing those events into play in specific conditions and times and places, right? And then just to kind of, before I pass it off to Brother Saad, even in history, we've actually had Muslim theologians and schools of thought have varied opinions on how they looked at qada and qadar, right? So there was the pro-deterministic school, right? The Jabariya and the, what are they? The Murjiya, right? That they said that, no, everything is completely programmed. We have no free will, no choice, right? And then there was also the school in Islamic history that we see, that the Mu'tazila or the Qadariya, right? That they said that these options are created for us, and so therefore we have to be able to choose, right? So they were completely on free will, that there was nothing that was destined and everything was in terms of free will. But we see many ayat that we presented that has both elements in it, right? So these were deviant sects that picked one or the other, whereas the Sunni school of theology, right, the Ahl Sunnah, we take the middle path, right? That we understand that both elements are there and both elements exist. And so there are certain aspects where things are predetermined and certain aspects in which we have free will, right? So in terms of that, I wanted to leave it to Brother Saad to kind of talk about, and then we'll get into the next aspect of are we fated or do we have free will? So Brother Saad, I believe I had your slide in here. Let me just double check.
If you just give me permission to share a screen, I'll just do it from here. If that's
Perfect.
Okay.
Yep.
Awesome. Okay, perfect. Man, using Zoom always reminds me of the pandemic phase of education. So it is what it is. Are you able to see my screen okay? And are you able to hear me okay?
We're all good.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wahda wa salatu wa salam ala man la nabiyya ba'da amma ba'd. I don't want to take a lot of your time, so I think you have, how much time is left for the actual session?
We end at 12:15.
15, okay. So how much more time do you need?
I will need just a few more minutes to kind of recap and finish up.
Perfect.
Yep.
I will try to be quick with this, inshallah, but it's actually lengthy, but it's not too bad. When I first sat in this program, we were actually assigned to sit in this program as we had certain high school students take these classes at our masjid, and the presenters were from various regions around the country, one of the things that we identified right away was that there's going to be some struggles. There's going to be some struggles that students feel and experience when they learn about this, and there's going to be some struggles that teachers will also experience. So one of the main ones is when you face off with this question of predestiny. So I'm not here to explain predestiny or qada and qadar. I'm just here to highlight some things that may come up and how we want to consider approaching it. So I titled this like the problem with al-qada and al-qadar. Obviously, there's no problem with it. This is in Quran, it's in Hadith. There's no problem with it. However, it's the problem that comes of it just because of sometimes things that are easily addressed. So first thing, there's going to be 7 things I'm looking at. We're looking at rationale / logic, definition, deviant groups, wayward thoughts, dua and dhikr, questions and acceptance. And from these 7, actually, it becomes 5 ideas. And the reason why I mentioned these 7 things is that I actually teach this topic to my juniors. And these are the 7 things that always come up in my juniors when we go over Aqidah al-Tahawiyah. And this is what teachers struggle with sometimes as well. So you're going to struggle with these 7. Why? Because the struggles will be, the first concern, this idea of, okay, for so many years, I've been taught to use my mind, use my intellect. My first memory of college was coming to class, sitting with Professor Kipperman, and we were going over Kubla Khan's Xanadu. Even right there, just the title is sufficient for a person to be like, what are you talking about? And I was just recovering from an accident. And so I didn't have the ability to sit in class. I came and he asked, what do you all think? And no one raised their hand. I raised my hand. I gave some complete garbage explanation because I hadn't even read the poem yet until he asked us in class to do so. And he's like, oh, that's very insightful. And at that point, I knew that sometimes we put way too much emphasis on logic. And that's something that's going to happen when we go into this concept. Islamically speaking, we have to find that balance early on where students are encouraged to use their intelligence and logic, but they cannot supersede. It was one of the previous classes where you went over the hierarchy of gaining knowledge, right, Ms. Bassett? Where it was the hawas al-khamsa, the 5 senses, and then it went, yeah, okay, perfect. And then we have to also talk about differentiating between the 2 terms, because sometimes people get caught up in these 2 terms so much that the teachers wonder, how can I explain this? Also, the groups give teachers a problem. Students having minds that wander give teachers a problem. Teachers don't know what's dhikr or how to combat these thoughts. Who can they ask? And is doubt even bad? So when we're looking at these 7 concerns, we can actually use cross-curricular partnerships in our school to be able to conquer a lot of the concerns that come up. For example, when you have the 7th concern, doubt. Doubt is not a bad thing. Doubt is common within religion. In fact, we'll go into the hadith very shortly. But you have to have the right person to be able to address the doubt. So it might be your school counselor, or it might be the Islamic studies teacher. The historicity, concern 3, of the deviant groups, people get so afraid of it. It's not really a problem. But maybe we use the history teacher to be able to show this rather than putting that weight on top of the Islamic studies teacher. So principals and classes need to know that we can actually make the team effort. Why? Because tackling this issue is difficult. So now I'm going to very quickly go over some of the concerns that come up for teachers. Number 1, teachers have to be aware of the fact that qada and qadar can be counterintuitive. Why? Because when Allah describes a believer in the Quran, the first description he gives after he says the word muttaqeen, he says, alladhina yu'minuna bil ghayb, those individuals who believe in the unseen. So it is part and parcel of our Islamic studies classes, even when going through the wisdom of science and the progress of science, to always recognize that historically science was actually used to be able to show the beauty of the creation power of God. Unfortunately, it's become warped over the past few centuries, but initially it was actually used to be able to understand and appreciate God more. So we have to let students understand that there will be a limit to everything. It's actually counterintuitive. If I'm going to use my logic and logic is created, then how can I understand the uncreated, the one who always existed? And then we can use examples such as love. Someone had to explain logically, why'd you fall in love with someone? There's no explanation. It's like the same person who gets in a fight with that person, the same person who loves that person, doesn't make sense. Fanaticism. Why do you choose LeBron over Jordan or vice versa? Stats don't lie, but the stats are just stats. It's just something in a person's heart. So we can use these things to let students understand, or even a favorite color. My favorite color is white. Why? It just is. So when we look at students, teachers should not be afraid of addressing the idea that logic does have limits, and it's okay to accept that. And in fact, part of accepting our weakness and limitations will allow us to progress and have greater strengths. Number two, the definition of each term is something that teachers get very confused with. Sheikh Yasser Qadi has a very nice presentation. It's very short, online, where he defines the two terms, qada and qadr. And the first two opinions from the scholars are interchangeable. And the third opinion is it's actually that they mean the same thing. And so we don't want to get so caught up in this term, the definitions of a term, such that students become confused. If they can understand the concept, then they're well equipped for their own personal practice. And if they are confronted by someone or some ideology outside of school, or maybe when they're in college, etc. Third concern is the historicity. Yes, we had the Mu'tazila. The Mu'tazila were the rationalists, and now we have the Neo-Mu'tazila, and they exist today. They sort of joined with the Qadariya, and some scholars say they're the same people. One gave birth to the other. But it's important for our students to know, okay, why do a lot of these conversations begin? Well, in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, though they lingered, they weren't really there. Why? Because people were living in a time, one, that was a bit simpler, but two, where there was just acceptance. But as people began to progress in their discoveries of different regions, different cultures, different ideologies, different philosophies, they became interested. Greek philosophy in particular really impacted Muslim history. And we see that the Muslims, the Mu'tazila, I should say, they took as a central idea the idea of the justice of Allah, and everything had to fit in the justice of Allah. And so they had to become Qadariya in that regard. They had to accept the fact that free will was a dominant characteristic. The Jabariya, they couldn't accept that. Why? Because you're taking away a characteristic of God. You're saying that Allah does not have control over everything. So they had to go to the opposite extreme. Ahl Sunnah and Jama'ah were in between. Well, this goes back to the first concern. If you're going to be limiting yourself with logic, then as a student, you're not going to be able to accept this. This is where a history teacher coming will be wonderful. When you teach the Enlightenment period, and afterwards in British literature, you see comes what? The Romantic period. It's a response to the Enlightenment period. Then comes what? The Victorian period. It's a response to the Enlightenment period. Then we see modernism, postmodernism. They're all responses. And that's important for students to see that this is going to be an idea that historically, when there's any extreme, the opposite will always respond. And so when you see the beauty of our approach was accepting both, it may not fit logically, but we're not people who determine our fate based on logic. We determine our fate based upon belief in what Allah Ta'ala tells us to do. Number 4 and 6, these concerns were stopping the mind from venturing too far and asking the proper questions to the proper people. The Prophet and the companions of the Allah, they had concerns. One time, a companion came to the Prophet, Abu Hurairah narrates, and he was, "Oh, Messenger of Allah, if they see what's in my heart, like I'm embarrassed, I can't present what's in my heart. If people knew what I was thinking, the thoughts they would have of me." So the Prophet said, that is true Iman. The fact, he didn't say, astaghfirullah, you have these thoughts in your heart. These thoughts are going to happen. You're normal. You're interacting with the world, and the world will sometimes put doubts into your heart. The fact that you feel bad about it and you want to somehow be able to rectify it, that is Iman. So when students have wandering minds that go to these areas, and then some Islamic studies teachers will say, well, just don't think about it. That is part of the solution the Prophet ﷺ gave, but it wasn't the only solution. So we can't just say, stop thinking about it, because what they basically hear is, don't talk to me about it, and just stop thinking about it, so you'll go to someone else. And that's not what we want to happen. The Prophet ﷺ was there for the companions to ask questions to. And if you don't know, like there's many times I don't know, Say, look, I'll find out for you, or I'll invite someone in to address the class. And finally, concerns 5 and 7, which is which dhikr should we use and how should doubt be in our lives? Worship is more than a ritual practice. So the Prophet ﷺ, when the situation came up, people having these doubts, in one narration he says, "Duhawqa, la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah." In another narration, they begin to think, well, who created so and so? Who's creating so and so? Then who created Allah? He said, say, "A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim." So we should be very keen on not making this only an intellectual practice. Let them know that if they have doubts, it's okay. But one of the ways to fight doubt is through worship. إِذَا لَقِيتُمْ فِئَةً فَاثْبُتُوا. When you face the opposing army in battle, be firm. How? I got so much doubts in my mind. What's going to happen to my wife, my kids? What's going to happen to me? What are they going to do to me? فَاثْبُتُوا. How firm? How do I become firm? وَاذْكُرُوا اللَّهَ كَثِيرًا. Remember Allah excessively. But we should be careful, because certain things were prescribed by the Prophet ﷺ for every dhikr has a power. So we should be careful that we look in the books of our past to see what we should ask our students to read. For example, some students should not read Allahu Akbar Allah. If they do, they'll actually, there'll be a different result than them saying La ilaha illallah. And Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Rajab, Ibn Qayyim, Imam al-Ghazali, rahimahumullah, all these people, they've written a lot about this. And I'm going to wrap up with this. Our early generations, they had 3 levels of fiqh. Fiqh al-asghar, fiqh al-awsat, fiqh al-akbar. Fiqh al-asghar is the fiqh that we teach today, ahkam, rulings. Fiqh al-awsat, good character. Fiqh al-akbar was what? Aqidah. They taught the names of Allah early on to kids so that they could understand, okay, if Allah is the most merciful, He's not going to put me in hell without my having free will. If Allah is the most just, He won't put me into hell without my having free will, because then it's not fair. So we have to have them fall in love with Allah and learn these attributes of Allah as a method by which we can then have the foundation for discussions like we're having today. I'll stop over here. It went longer than I wanted. Sorry, everyone.
No, we appreciate it. Jazakallah khair for that enlightening caveat to our discussion. Alhamdulillah. I think that helps a lot, especially with us as teachers, to be able to present these kind of difficult topics to the students. So Jazakallah khair very much. And Jazakallah khair to all of you for attending. So I wanted to leave it there for if there are any further questions on our topic of qada and qadar. So if not, then inshallah, what I'd like to do is we'll leave it for the survey. So like I mentioned, inshallah, we'd like to always have feedback from all of you that is there anything that you learned and you found to be beneficial that you see yourself, inshallah, implementing within the classroom. And so I will actually let me put the link here as well in the chat. So that way you guys have that as well. And perhaps that would be a little bit easier for all of you as well. But inshallah, so for the next session, inshallah, what we will be covering is that we will finish off actually this discussion of qada and qadar from a scientific perspective, right? So we looked at it from an Islamic perspective and we saw a little bit about what how we look at these things and this aspect of qada and qadar. But is there any relationship to that in science, right? Is there any way that we could look at it from a scientific perspective? So we'll finish off that discussion, inshallah, next time with the scientific element of qada and qadar in terms of determinism. And then, inshallah, we'll cover the last unit of the Bioscience and Islam curriculum, which will be answering the fundamental question of, are humans unique in the universe? So this will be a science and theological inquiry about extraterrestrial intelligent life. And then we'll finish off, inshallah. So since Thursday is our last session, we will have a knowledge cafe and harvest. So we'll look through some of the things that we've learned in all of these seminars and work with that epistemic framework worksheet that all of you should have. And if you need a copy of that, inshallah, I will have them email that out again, just so that way you have that on hand. But that's kind of what we plan on doing for our last session, inshallah, on Thursday. Inshallah, looking forward to seeing all of you on Thursday, same time, same place, inshallah ta'ala. So if there are no further questions or comments, then inshallah, we will leave it there. Jazakallah khair, all of you, for sticking with us. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put barakah in our time and efforts and guide us to be the excellent educators for the betterment of our ummah and for the future of our ummah as well. And may this be a sadaqah jariyah for all of us, so that way we can propagate and implement it, inshallah ta'ala. Ameen.
Jazakumullah khair, and thank you all. Jazakallah khair, Sheikh Saad and Ms. Bassett, for imparting so much wisdom and knowledge. Alhamdulillah. And thank you all. Please do make sure you attend next on Thursday, day after tomorrow, inshallah, so that we can provide you with the surveys and you can receive your certificate of completion for this PD. Assalamu alaikum.
Jazakallah khair.
Aisha, if we could just stay on and maybe coordinate the time for our meeting for tomorrow.
Sounds good.
Let everybody else jump off, inshallah. And sometimes people walked away, so I'll just remove them. Okay.
Walaikum assalam.
Assalamu alaikum. Wa alaikum salam, Brother Khalil. I'll let you sign out, Brother Khalil, if it of like actually genuinely trying to integrate an Islamic worldview into everything, to the extent that like they don't just teach like solitary subjects, which is the problem in our like, this is such a Western colonial concept, like to have these bifurcated or like, you know,
against secular studies, right?
Yeah. Oh, secular and sacred.
Yeah.
As we can see, this is part of what causes the problem.
Right.
So yeah, I feel like there's so much that I've learned from sitting here, even like I said, in my partial way, that I do think that this really fits in. So inshallah, if you could join, it'd be a huge asset. Okay, inshallah, I'll share the details about that via WhatsApp with you. Okay, Aisha, jazakallah khairan. Assalamu alaikum. Talk to you tomorrow.
Inshallah.
Inshallah.